Well, I'm really happy to be here today because it's always a great feeling to be in a room full of fellow truth seekers. Is there anybody here today from the dairy industry? Dairy farmers? Okay, I always like to know who I'm speaking to. So because of the advent of the internet, of email, of texting, blogging, faxing, tweeting, of 24-hour news, of YouTube, MySpace, Facebook, and similar media, you and I now have access to more information in a 24-hour period than our grandparents had access to in their entire lifetime. It's an amazing thought. But with that access comes increasing exposure to increasingly sophisticated forms of advertising and promotions, as well as innumerable opinions from people who are both credible and not so credible, which makes it all the more important that we be discerning in our search for the truth. You know, in the last, I think, 7, 8 years, there have been a number of really important documentary films that have come out. And these films actually made it into theaters, which is an amazing feat for a documentary film. These were films that served to kind of pull the veil back and allow us to peer in behind the scenes and find out more about what's involved in the production of foods we eat, how these foods are marketed to us, and the impact of some of these foods on our health. And I'm sure many of you saw these films. I'm talking about Fast Food Nation, Food Inc., Super Size Me, Forks Over Knives, like that. And these films were great because they served to empower the audiences who saw them and help them to make more informed choices. But I think they also did something else. I think they contributed to a real shifting of the climate in terms of, well, truth seekers having access to information. Because a lot of the industries, the food industry, has kind of clamped down, sort of battened their hatches down. And I understand. They're wanting to protect themselves, protect their reputation, their products and brands. It's increasingly difficult to get into these facilities, to get interviews with representatives, to get cameras into farm areas. And I can tell you firsthand, as a filmmaker, it is really, really difficult. It's a very different climate now. There are now 13 states in this country that have food disparagement laws on the books. Have you heard about these? Some people call them veggie libel laws. These laws were designed expressly to dissuade you from saying anything less than flattering about a food commodity in this country. And that's even if what you're talking about is based upon the scientific literature. You're still at risk, lest you find yourself a defendant in one of these lawsuits that could literally break you financially. There is a pending lawsuit right now. I don't think the decision's been made. It's been under consideration for a couple of weeks. And this is a lawsuit that has been brought against ABC, Diane Sawyer, and her colleagues over a broadcast that they did in which they referred to an ammonia-treated meat product as pink slime. And the producer of that product said that, this was defamatory language. It's resulted in them having to let go employees. There's been a dip in sales, and they want accountability. And so they have brought this lawsuit for $1.2 billion in damages. Now, the fact that this has been under consideration as long as it has troubles me, because it feels almost as though they may be considering that there could be merit to this. The official complaint says that they referred to the product during the broadcast 132 times as pink slime. If this goes through, it's going to have a chilling effect, I believe, on our ability to know to what's going on with regard to our food that we eat. Because the people who are the truth seekers, the people that go out in the trenches and do the hard work, the journalists and such, who put themselves on the line to bring this information back to us, I think are going to think twice before they do that again. So it's an interesting climate. Even my literary agent shared with me, she said, when she was marketing Whitewash, looking for a publisher, she had 2 publishers who expressed strong interest in it. But they said, we like the message, we like what you've got here and everything, but it's just too hot to handle. And so she pressed them a little more and said, what do you mean? And they said, well, we don't want to find ourselves defendants in a costly and protracted lawsuit. Even if the information in there is based upon the science and is factual, the process could bleed us financially to the point that we'd have to close our doors. And so they passed. But luckily, my publisher, New Society, is an activist publisher. And they seized the opportunity. They're Canadian, so I don't think they're really aware of how litigious things are in the lower 48. But I'm here today really for one reason. I'm inspired by a concept, informed consent. When you go to a hospital, let's say you go to a hospital to have a surgical procedure. Before you have that surgery, you are going to have to fill out medical informed consent forms. These forms are going to disclose to you all the potential things that could go wrong during that surgical procedure. Some things fairly benign, other things more serious, including death. And so you read over this information, and also it's disclosed to you that there are alternatives you may want to seek out in place of the surgery. And you process this information, and ultimately you make a decision. Probably more often than not, you decide to go ahead and have a surgical procedure. You sign your name there, and you say, I understand these risks. I understand the risks associated with this procedure, and I'm going to go forward. I'm giving my informed consent. But most of us are not making informed choices on a daily basis, especially with regard to the food that we eat. Our choices are based upon hearsay, propaganda, and a rich mythology in which we have grown up steeped. And as a result, they may not be the best choices for us and our loved ones. So today, I'm going to change that with regard to one thing: milk. Now, every one of you in here is a bit of a milk expert already. I know that because all of you have been students of the dairy industry's teachings all your life, beginning when maybe you were 1.5 or 2, and that's when you began to hear messages about the value of having cow's milk in your life. And it may have been a parent or a preschool teacher, and later it may have been a kindergarten or first grade teacher using all the literature that the dairy industry provides to them. And maybe as you got older, it was an athletic coach, a nutritionist, a dietitian. And so over time, you came to know certain things. Maybe it was the Got Milk campaign, the Milk Mustache, the Everybody Needs Milk, or the Milk Has Something for Everybody campaign. The messages just keep coming. And so you came to the conclusion that milk is pure, milk is wholesome, milk is full of goodness. It's part of responsible parenting. And of course, it's essential for human health, right? Especially our bone health. Well, I've been traveling around over the last year and a half, working on a documentary film on this subject and talking to lots of people about milk and calcium and bone health and their beliefs about these things. And if you'd been with me, you would have come to see, just as I have, how deeply rooted that mythology I just cited is, and how challenged the average person is to extricate themselves from that way of thinking. It's really like our collective common sense has been put out to pasture by the single most effective advertising campaign in history. And I mean this. This is a campaign, after all, that has convinced you that you need to be nursing from another species. For any reason. This is a campaign that has been so long running, over 7 decades, and so far reaching. It is a campaign that has transcended our education system, our medical community, the dietetics and nutritionist community, the media community, the political community. So it's difficult to find anyone today who's not been touched by this campaign, who's not been persuaded by the truly perverted message of this campaign. But in the end, what I'm talking about here is just another product that's manufactured and marketed by an industry that's seeking to make a profit. And just like many other industries, like the car tire industry or the shampoo industry or the luggage industry, the dairy industry employs certain strategic principles. First, they manufacture their product as cheaply as they possibly can. Control your cost. Second, they convince you of an absolute need of this product. You can't live without it. And then they advertise it to you relentlessly. Over and over and over, they keep driving this message in until it solidifies in your mind. Now, if we were talking about car tires or we were talking about luggage or shampoo or something fairly innocuous, would we be concerned? No. Right? We have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech and expression, and we can say what we want. At least there are 13 states where we can't now, but we're not talking about something innocuous. What we're talking about are the mammary gland secretions of another species. And those mammary gland secretions that we call milk are a carrier for up to 60 different hormones and growth factors and a vast array of chemical contaminants, together which I believe may be undermining our health. Now, the question that this brings me to is the exposure justified? I know it sounds strange. How do you justify exposing someone to growth hormones that were never intended for them, or pesticides, herbicides, dioxin, flame retardant, rocket fuel, and on and on and on? Well, let's just say that drinking this product offered us some special benefit, some intrinsic quality that we couldn't match anywhere else, that it was truly unique, or one of a kind, and that the results of consuming it were so reliable, so consistent, and brought us just what we were promised. Well, then we maybe assume some risk, right? We assume risk in lots of things that we do, but we do so by looking at the risk benefits, right? And we calculate, am I willing to take this much risk to get this result? So the only way to really answer that question is to look at the outcomes. To look at the outcomes, because we've been promised that if we just drink our 3 glasses of milk a day and eat a lot of cheese and yogurt and, of course, ice cream, then we're going to have healthy, fracture-resistant bones all our life. That's the story. But here's the reality. There are 12 million Americans suffering from osteoporosis right now. There'll be 1.5 million fractures this year in this country. The CDC says another 34 million are at elevated risk of developing the disease because they have something called osteopenia, which is a lower than idealized bone density. It's not a reliable predictor of future fracture, but it definitely warrants caution. 340,000 Americans are going to go into hospitals this year for hip surgery to contend with hip fracture, a lifetime cost of about $80,000. None of them will enjoy the independence and mobility that they did before that intervention. 50% of them will be rendered dependent upon others for the rest of their life. 20% will die within 12 months of that procedure because of complications directly related to that. If you're an American male, you have a 1 in 5 chance that you're going to suffer an osteoporotic fracture in your lifetime. If you're a female, your chance is 1 in 3. Does that sound like success? Sound like we got what we were promised? And the interesting thing is when you look at the epidemiology, when you review the studies and look at what's going on around the world, it's the very populations that consume the most milk and calcium where you see the highest incidence of bone fracture. So I'm talking about Australia, New Zealand, Canada, North America, the Western European nations. That's where all the disease is. And the inverse is so. The inverse is so. So when you look at China, Thailand, Vietnam, South Africa, you see so little of this disease. And these people don't have milk mustaches. And they're not popping CalMag tablets, and they're not calculating how many milligrams of calcium they had in their last meal. And yet they're doing so much better than us. How can this be? How can this be? What I just described to you is totally the opposite of what you've been told since you were little. Just drink all that milk, Johnny and Sally, and everything's going to be fine. You're not only going to have strong bones, but you're going to be sexy and glamorous like the celebrities with the milk mustaches, and have tremendous athletic prowess like the athletes who have the milk mustaches. Well, the only way that it can be is if the advice we've been given is erroneous advice. If the recipe for bone health that we've been given is the wrong recipe. So, if the recipe we've been given is the wrong recipe and does not produce the outcomes reliably that we seek, then from a public health standpoint, do we not have an obligation to disclose to the public what kinds of risks are associated with following that advice? I think we do. There was a researcher out at Harvard University, School of Public Health. His name is Mark Hegsted. And Mark Hegsted devised something called the Hegsted equation, looking at dietary fats, predicting heart disease risk. And he worked at the USDA Center for Human Nutrition, helping create dietary guidelines for Americans. And he was a bit of a giant in the world of nutrition. He was a professor of nutrition at Harvard. And he was really interested in calcium and osteoporosis epidemiology. And late in his career, he said something that really resonated with me. He said, "It will be embarrassing enough if the current calcium hype is useless. But it will be immeasurably worse if the recommendations are detrimental to health." So how could our preoccupation with calcium derived from cow's milk possibly prove detrimental to our health? That's what I want to show you now. Because of our determination to be good students of the dairy industry's teachings, we have gobbled up all of the milk that we can, and all of the yogurt, and all of the cheese, and the ice cream, and we felt good about this, right? We're following the advice, we're compliant, we're doing what we're told. But in the process of doing so, we are unwittingly exposing ourselves to hormones and growth factors. Because they don't tell you that on the milk carton. And hormones, we hear a lot about these days, don't we? We hear about athletes taking hormones. We hear about postmenopausal women taking hormone replacement therapy. And now we even hear about men. We hear about men taking human growth hormone to reclaim their youth and vitality. But what are they? What are these substances? Hormones are chemical messengers, and they travel throughout the body. They're released by a variety of endocrine glands, and they exert their effect on various target tissues. These are tissues that have receptors for them. And you can think of a receptor and a hormone as sort of a lock and key system. So you have this hormone molecule that goes into the receptor and activates a whole cascade of events in the body. We've learned that hormones are responsible for so many things, growth, reproduction, metabolism, even mood, among many other things. But we know that the body wants to keep hormones in a very delicate balance. And when they get out of balance, the likelihood of disease goes up. So to give you an idea, imagine an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We'll drain it of water and fill it with lime juice. And then we'll take an eyedropper and we'll drop 1 drop of tequila in there. We'll have the world's biggest margarita. A weak one, albeit. That's 1 part per trillion. That's the ratio at which hormones work in our body. Tiny levels. So I want to talk to you about 2 diseases. These are 2 diseases that everyone in this room will have been touched by in some way. And that's because the incidence of these diseases has gone up so substantially over the last few decades that it seems every one of us has been touched. It may be that you've had a personal diagnosis, or a loved one, a friend, a colleague, a coworker. I'm talking about breast cancer and prostate cancer. And I want to begin by talking about breast cancer. Breast cancer now strikes 1 in 8 women in their lifetime in North America. And if you look at all the conventionally accepted risk factors for breast cancer, I'm talking about early menarche, late menopause, earlier late pregnancy, or not having pregnancy, not breastfeeding, use of alcohol, use of hormone replacement therapy. All of these things come back to one thing. There's a common thread that runs through them all, and it's your cumulative lifetime exposure to estrogen. And that's what the experts will tell you. They'll say, it's about your total exposure to estrogen that we have the biggest concern. And that's not to say that all the breast cancer that we see is estrogen-driven, because it's not. Just the lion's share. So if what they're saying is we need to minimize our exposure to estrogen if we can, other than those risk factors that I just mentioned to you, how else can we do so? Well, diet is a very powerful way. Diet has an influence on the hormone economy in the body, and in this regard, we have learned that women who eat a high-fat diet have much higher levels of estrogen than women who have a low-fat diet. And we've learned that fiber is essential to hormone balance in the body, because after the body's used the hormones for one reason or another, they're bound to fiber and excreted from the body. But in the absence of adequate fiber, they can be reabsorbed and elevate hormone levels. So we know that if we put women on a high-fiber, low-fat diet, as UCLA researchers did, and we measure their estrogen levels at baseline, and then we track them over a period of weeks, something happens. Their estrogen levels plummet. Very interesting. And after a couple of weeks, we're talking about a 37% drop in the last study I saw. I mean, that's impressive. So how else can we affect our exposure to estrogen? Well, milk, cow's milk. Because cow's milk is the source from which you will get 80% of all the exogenous estrogen in your life. That is the estrogen from outside your body. Number one source. But they don't tell you that. Nobody tells you that. And we do something in this country that compounds the problem, because other dairying nations don't do this. They know better. We want to get as much milk from these animals as we possibly can. And so we milk them about 330 days a year, right through their pregnancy. We keep them in a constant cycle of lactation. As soon as they give birth, we're artificially inseminating them again, because you know dairy cows don't produce milk just because they're a dairy cow. They have to be impregnated. That's how they make milk. So what happens is, as a pregnancy advances, the milk changes with regard to the amount of estrogen that's in it and other hormones. Such that if you have a cow who gives birth and you take some of her milk and put it in a glass, and then you have another cow who you're milking through late stage, maybe the end of the third trimester of her pregnancy, and you put that in a glass and you compare them, this cow's milk has up to 33 times more estrogen in it than this cow's. And they don't tell you that. They say, have another glass. Have some more cheese. Have some more yogurt. So there's another thing I want to tell you about milk, and it's called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. You've probably heard about it. It gets a lot of attention these days, because we know that people who maintain the highest levels of IGF-1 have a substantially elevated risk of developing breast, colon, and prostate cancer compared to those who maintain the lowest levels. And with regard to breast cancer, we've seen that women who are postmenopausal, who have the highest IGF-1 levels, have about a 3 times elevated risk of developing the disease compared to those with the lowest levels. But if you're premenopausal, the risk can be up to 7-fold higher in those who have the highest levels. So why is that? Well, IGF-1 is interesting. We have it in our bodies at the highest levels during puberty. It acts on the breast tissue in young women, and it tapers off around 17, 18 in young women, and in young men around 19, 20. And it'll never be that high again. But IGF-1 is produced by cows. It's just like our IGF-1. So when we drink cow's milk, we drink the IGF-1, and our IGF-1 levels go up. And why is this significant? Well, IGF-1 is not the thing you want to have in high amounts on your team if your interest is in preventing cancer. And here's why. There's certain attributes to IGF-1 that are not supportive of cancer prevention. First, it's a mitogen, so it promotes cell division, and unregulated cell division is the central theme in cancer. It promotes malignancy. It is required for tumor formation. And it promotes metastasis. You know what metastatic cancer is? You can have a localized cancer, and these days, we do fairly well by excising a cancer and sewing people up and sending them on their way. Survival rates are pretty good. But it's metastatic cancers when the cancer colonizes other organs, and you have multiple cancer sites. That's when things get complicated, and that's the cancer more often than not that kills. IGF-1 promotes that. And then IGF-1 interferes with something else called apoptosis, which is something that's going on all the time in the body. You have a rogue cell that's damaged, getting out of control, could lead down the road to the cancer cascade. It self-extinguishes. Some people call it cell suicide. Eliminates itself, which is a great thing. We need that. Well, IGF-1 inhibits that process. So this is not a friend. This is a foe in this regard. And there are a couple of things that we're doing that are complicating the problem with our exposure to IGF-1. The first is, some years back, dairy farmers noticed that certain cows produced more milk for the same amount of feed. So they started to look into it, trying to understand why. And they found that certain cows, just because of their genetics, they made more IGF-1. And that led to more milk. So more bang for the buck. For the same amount of feed, you're getting more milk. So they said, hey, this is pretty interesting. What if all our cows were high IGF-1 producers? That would be cool. Well, if you're in the business of selling milk, that might be. But if you're in the business of drinking it, it's not. So what they did was they started breeding their dairy herds to favor the high IGF-1 producers. And over time, these herds became populated with high IGF-1 producing cows. So we already got this elevation in IGF-1 due to that. And then, of course, somebody came along and said, hey, have I got a product for you? Just put this needle in the rear end of your cow and shoot this stuff in, and they're going to make even more milk. And, of course, the dairy industry was attracted to that idea. More milk. We always want more milk. And so they jumped on the bandwagon and started using recombinant bovine growth hormone. Well, how does RBGH make a cow produce more milk? Anybody have any ideas? Boosts IGF-1 production. So now you got a double whammy. You got them bred to favor high IGF-1. You've got this genetically engineered product that is causing them to produce more IGF-1. And I've talked to you about the risks associated with breast cancer. I'm going to talk to you about prostate cancer now. Prostate cancer now strikes 1 in 6 men in North America. And if you heard that statistic before, you read it somewhere, maybe you went to your doctor and you said, hey, doc, I'm a little concerned about this. What can I do to lower my risk? And even the most well-intending physician may have said something like this. Well, we don't know what causes prostate cancer. We don't. But, you know, you eat a balanced diet. And you might have said, a balanced diet. Every time I open the newspaper, there's another definition of what a balanced diet is. I mean, what should I be eating? Well, everything in moderation. Oh, moderation. Okay. And get some exercise and make sure to drink some water and you'll be okay. And it's, you know, there's the genetics, and so you can't do anything about that. And so you may not be feeling very empowered, and maybe you start walking towards the door, and just before you get your hand on the doorknob, the doctor says, well, as long as you're here, why don't I perform a DRE on you? And you say, oh, DRE, what's that? Digital rectal exam. Yeah, I can palpate your prostate gland and tell you if it's enlarged. And you say, well, you know, actually, I think I've got to get to an appointment. I'm going to run out the door right now. I'll call you later on that one. But even if you stayed and did that, what did that do to lessen your risk of developing prostate cancer? Didn't do anything. Yeah. So maybe you have lunch with a friend, your friend says, well, what a bummer. That was an unfortunate experience. You ought to see my doctor. My doctor's really forward-thinking and stays up on the literature, and I don't know, I always love going there because I learned so much. And you say, okay, I'll go see your doctor. And you go see this doctor, and the doctor says, I'm really glad you came here today because I'm concerned about prostate cancer risk. And so I've been looking at the literature in my spare time. And do you know there are 23 studies now that show that those who drink the most milk have about a doubling of their risk of developing prostate cancer compared to those who drink the least or none at all? And now he's got your attention. And you say a doubling of the risk of prostate cancer because of milk drinking? And he says, yeah, that's prostate cancer in general. But it's a quadrupling of risk of metastatic prostate cancer, the kind that kills. And now he's really got your attention. So you may turn to your doctor and say, how come I hadn't heard this before? I mean, how come no one's talking about this? And he'll say, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. So, two key diseases that have an interesting relationship to milk. And I'm going to talk to you about a few other diseases. I want to talk to you about Parkinson's. I don't know if anyone's talked about Parkinson's disease yet this weekend. Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease. It affects the central nervous system. It's named after James Parkinson, who was a British physician. And this is a disease that results in certain hallmark symptoms. You see a deterioration of memory and thought process. You see loss of facial expression, tremor of the hand, an uncoordinated gait, and there's a rigidity that settles in on the musculature over time. And this is a really cruel disease to witness. My father was diagnosed just over a year ago, and he was somebody who had an incredible mind and spoke French and Chinese and had an international business with thousands of customers and traveled all over the world and played in the stock market and would love to do prodigious math problems in his head while other people were struggling to figure it out on calculators. And today he can't make change for $1. He can't read the time on a clock face. And sometimes he makes sense. Sometimes he's very lucid, and other times his words are just a jumble, melange of nonsense. If you look online or you go to doctors and you talk to them, you go to experts, you say, what's going on with Parkinson's? What puts us at risk for Parkinson's? They'll say, well, it's got to be genes, it's got to be genetics. Somehow we're predisposed, but we don't know what causes it, and we don't know what causes it. But there's some interesting information out there, some interesting theories, and milk comes to play here again with Parkinson's disease risk. There have been a number of studies that have shown that as milk drinking goes up, Parkinson's disease risk goes up. People who drink the most milk compared to those who drink the least or none at all may have about a doubling of their risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And this is one that kind of threw researchers, They thought, well, wait a second, what in the milk could be contributing to the risk of Parkinson's disease? And at the top of their list of suspects was the neurodegenerative pesticides that accumulate in milk and dairy products. And it's an interesting theory because people who work with pesticides professionally, exterminators who apply them, they have about a 70% elevated risk for developing Parkinson's disease. And people who work in intensive agriculture where they spray copious amounts of these chemicals, they have about a 70% elevated risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And people who live in close proximity to intensive spraying in agriculture have an elevated risk for Parkinson's because they get exposed to the drift through the windows and doors and such in their community. And we know that in laboratory experiments where we sacrifice animals and we dose them with these chemicals, they develop symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And when we do autopsy on the brain tissue of people who have died from Parkinson's disease, we find a higher concentration of these neurodegenerative chemicals. So it shouldn't be a surprise because obviously we haven't established causation here, and certainly genes play a role, but it really shouldn't be a surprise because pesticides, of which there are 16,000 different formulas approved for use in this country, are designed to destroy the nervous system of living things. That's how they work. They create a paralysis, rapid onset. But that's what the design of these chemicals is. So the FDA has been doing for years these periodic surveys. They call it the market basket survey, where they go get food randomly from markets all over the country, and then they test them for contaminants just to find out what we're being exposed to. And in their last survey, all 740 milk samples had pesticide residues in them. Now I want to move on to another condition. I want to just talk to you very quickly about heart disease. I'm not going to go into any depth. We could talk about that for hours. Heart disease, you may or may not have heard this as well, is it's the number one killer in this country. It takes more lives than all forms of cancer combined. Every 34 seconds, another American has a heart attack. And in about 40% of cases, that's the first symptom. They don't know that they have heart disease because it can advance for decades without any symptom, without anyone really knowing that they've got it. And like many chronic degenerative diseases, it's a multifactorial disease. There are many factors that come together to set the stage and put you at risk. But if you look at it from a dietary standpoint, you'll hear a lot from conservative public health organizations about dietary saturated fat. And a lot will refer to it as the artery clogging dietary saturated fat and how that increases risk. Well, milk and dairy products are the number one source of saturated fat in the American diet. And there's a lot of interesting research related to that, looking at heart disease and milk consumption and such that you can look online very easily. I want to talk to you about Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disease, and it's actually an autoimmune disease where the body turns on itself and starts attacking its own tissues. And Crohn's waxes and wanes. It has relapse remission. Relapse remission is how it progresses. The symptoms are inflamed gut with lesions, bloody diarrhea regularly, electrolyte imbalance, vitamin mineral deficiency, dehydration. And the treatment is typically anti-inflammatory drugs, immune suppressive drugs, both of which have issues too. Potentially serious side effects. But there's no cure and there's no known cause. You may have read about people curing Crohn's disease anecdotally, but for the most part, it's accepted that there is no known cure. And there's an interesting gentleman I interviewed in London, England. His name's John Herman Taylor, and he's at King's College. I interviewed him for my film, and he's been following this thread for a while. He's very, very interested in human Crohn's. And one day he became aware that there's this disease in dairy cattle that looks very strikingly similar to Crohn's disease in humans. And in fact, by all measures, it is basically Crohn's disease in dairy cattle. They call it Yanni's disease. The cows have the inflammation, the lesions, they have the bloody diarrhea, they are deficient in vitamins and minerals that they're not absorbing, they're dehydrated, and of course they're unproductive. A sick cow is not a productive cow, so they're not making money. And this is a real plague for the dairy industry. But the thing about Yanni's disease is they know what causes it. It's caused by something called Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis. It's a mouthful, or MAP. And this MAP is the cause of Yanni's. So John Herman Taylor said, could we be getting exposed to MAP? And could that be the cause of Crohn's disease in humans? And there weren't a lot of people to talk to about this because there hasn't been a lot of interest in this. So he started looking into MAP, and he put together got some funding, and he put together a team of researchers, and he said, let's go start talking to people who have Crohn's. And they found some Crohn's sufferers, and they said, we want to follow this thread. Can we take some tissue samples from you and examine them? And they did. And in 90% of the Crohn's sufferers, they found MAP. Now, John Herman Taylor will make, very bold statements about this. He's had his head in this for a long time. I think about a decade, maybe a little bit more, and he's published a number of times about this. But he told me on camera, he said, I believe that 90% of all the human Crohn's that we see today is caused by exposure to MAP. And I said, well, what about pasteurization? And he said, pasteurization doesn't kill MAP. I said, how do you know? He said, because, let me give you the studies. We've pulled and grown live MAP right out of milk pulled off store shelves in North America and in Europe. Small percent, about 1 to 3%, will grow that. Well, it's a bit of a lottery. I mean, who knows if they're getting that milk? So I looked up the USDA's surveys, because they do these herd surveys on disease incidents and such, and I wanted to find out how much MAP was present in the U.S. dairy herds. And the USDA's last survey says 68% of the herds have MAP. So it's an interesting, provocative thing to give some consideration to. But suffice it to say, putting MAP on your cornflakes in the morning may not be the best idea. Now I want to talk to you about contaminants. I want to talk to you about dioxin. Dioxin, you've probably heard about. Dioxin kind of came to the forefront after the Vietnam War, because many men and women who participated in that war came back with a whole host of symptoms, and very diverse. And they had these illnesses that no one could really attribute to anything, and the people who were providing health care were really kind of confused and didn't know what to make of it. And some started pushing and prodding and demanding more information. Over time, it came out that these soldiers were exposed to something called Agent Orange. Agent Orange is an herbicide, a defoliant, and we wanted to defoliate the jungle so that our enemy couldn't hide from us. So you've got that issue alone, which is not great, to be doused in or exposed to an herbicide. But in time, it came out that the defoliant was contaminated with dioxin. And that's kind of when people started to really pay attention to dioxin, to see if there may be some relationship between dioxin and some of these symptoms, some of these conditions that were being observed. And dioxin is kind of the name for a whole class of dioxin and dioxin-like compounds, about 75 different ones that are members of this group. And the one that we're most interested in, that the most research has been conducted around, is called 2378 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD. And that chemical we know is a human carcinogen. We also know that it's associated with type 1 diabetes, thyroid disease, immune dysfunction, higher incidence of allergies, complex allergies, and developmental disorders and birth defects. And interestingly, you know, when these soldiers started having kids, we started seeing, you know, illnesses in the next generation too, which has been followed as well. There's a gentleman, I think Arnold Schechter, I'm sure in Dallas, who's stayed with this for decades, very, very interested in it. So dioxin, if you want to minimize your exposure to it, you want to look at diet, because 90% of all the dioxin you will ever be exposed to comes from your diet. Okay? So if you put it on a hierarchy, where do you think the most dioxin is? Red meat. Red meat's the number one source of dioxin. And then position 2 and 3 are dairy products, different dairy foods and milk. That's where it concentrates. Because it's lipophilic. It binds with fat. It concentrates in the flesh of the animals. It bioaccumulates over time. And then when you slaughter the animal and cut it up, you take on you inherit that payload of bioconcentrated toxins. And when a dairy cow makes milk, she mobilizes her fat stores, and that's where all the chemicals are stored. So all those sequestered chemicals then get released in the milk. You drink the milk, you take it on. It's a hand-me-down poison. So dioxin is also, this form is also known to be an endocrine disruptor. It's a persistent synthetic hormone. So back to that original question of being exposed to hormones and hormone economy in the body, it's something you may want to pay attention to. Another thing I want to talk to you about is perchlorate. And perchlorate, and this is bizarre, it's rocket fuel. It's the explosive ingredient in solid booster rocket fuel. So it's used in rockets and missiles. It's actually used in safety restraint airbags in cars and fireworks as well. And it started showing up some years ago in water, and we didn't know a lot about it, but we do know that it's coming from military installations that have allowed it to leak into different waterways. It's been working its way into the Colorado River for quite a long time, which is diverted for irrigation purposes. And it's taken up by the root systems of the plants. It's integrated into the plant, and you feed the plant to an animal, And once again, that process begins where we inherit the payload of toxins from them. And it's been found in 217 of 232 milk samples. And again, we don't know a lot about perchlorate. There's some people that suspect it may be a human carcinogen. But I do know one thing. It interferes with the uptake of iodine, so it disrupts the production of thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is something that's pretty important when you're talking about, say, the development of a fetus. So if you have a mother who's pregnant and she's at a critical gestation window, say day 20, when the neural tubes are closing, and she gets an exposure that causes a fluctuation in thyroid hormone, there could be critical changes that occur in the nervous system of her offspring, irreversible, that will manifest later as attention deficit, IQ deficiency, learning disabilities, challenges like that. And no one will really ever know where to make the association. Where did that come from? Who knows? So it's interesting to think about. The EPA, they set a safe dose, kind of allowable level, like we do for all of these contaminants that we keep introducing in the environment. And if you follow that dubious recommendation, just from drinking milk, about 50% of kids 1 to 5 will exceed that dubious level. About 35% of children from 6 to 11 will be exposed. About 7% of women of childbearing age will exceed that exposure level. And the reason I say that is a dubious thing is, none of us are exposed to one of these things at a time. You're not just exposed to perchlorate. You're exposed to carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, neurotoxic chemicals, mercury, dioxin, perchlorate. What's the synergy? What's the concerted effect? How do these things compound the effect of one another? We just don't have that research. We just can't tell anybody. So once again, if you're being exposed to something that you don't need, it's not benefiting you, you have that opportunity to minimize your exposure. You have an opportunity to get that out of your diet and reduce your exposure to this, in this case, perchlorate. Another thing I want to talk to you about is antibiotics, and we've got two things going on with antibiotics. We've got antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria that are proliferating, and literally thousands of Americans are dying every year in hospitals because the conditions that they have, which we treated successfully just a handful of years ago, we can't eradicate. And nobody wants to be in that chair when a doctor walks in and says, "I'm sorry, we just can't do anything for you." But this is a serious, serious problem. And there are a growing number of scientists worldwide who, when asked what is responsible for this proliferation of antibiotic and multi-antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria, they point their finger right to animal agriculture. And they say, this is what it is. It is this wholesale abuse of medicines that should be reserved for humans that are being given to these animals as a matter of course. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of sick animals. We produce 12,000 tons of antibiotics in this country for use a year. Every year, 12,000 tons of antibiotics. But 80% of it is for animal agriculture. The rest is human medicine. So why are these animals on all these drugs? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is they're raised in such sordid conditions, unsanitary conditions, that they're prone to illness. And they're so close together, the way that they're housed, that if one becomes ill, it's very likely the next one's going to become ill. And pretty soon you've got a whole herd that's infected. So they figure, well, let's head it off in the past. Let's just keep him on a subtherapeutic level of antibiotics and we'll prevent this from starting in the first place. So you got that. And then you got this other thing that's really interesting is farmers learn that if you give animals antibiotics, they grow faster. We don't really know why, but they get to market weight faster. So more bang for the buck. You get something to market weight faster, or you get it so you can inseminate it and it'll start producing milk for you sooner. So we've got that going on. And what we see is these strains of bacteria that are coming out on these animal products, and if we get exposed to this bacteria that has this kind of drug resistance, the bacteria can share that resistance with bacteria in our body. They can pass that on. And it's the strong ones that proliferate. And then the next time we need one of these crucial medications, it may not be effective with us. This is a serious, serious problem. And the other thing is we don't want to be exposed to antibiotics in the first place. Nobody should have antibiotics on their cornflakes. And, the dairy industry will tell you, they'll say, we don't allow antibiotics in the milk. Sure, cattle are treated with antibiotics, but we don't allow it in the milk. We test every tanker. And if there's an antibiotic residue, we dump the milk. And I think they're right. I think they're absolutely speaking the truth there. They do. They do test every tanker. But the problem is they test them for 4 to 5 of the most common antibiotic drugs used in dairy farming. But the FDA allows them to use 30 different drugs in dairy farming. So I think it was early last year, it could have been the year before, the New York Times published a story where they went to a dairy cattle slaughter facility. And they did a story on the investigators who were there checking the carcasses for antibiotics. And they found these elevated levels of antibiotics, legal antibiotics, but they also found antibiotics that were not permissible for use in dairy cows. Much higher than they thought they were going to find. And the inspector said, I wonder if this means that the antibiotics could be getting into the milk. But we know that antibiotics get into the milk. It's kind of an odd thing for them to postulate at that point. But when they suggested that because of these findings that they create stronger enforcement in terms of testing and the regulation of the drugs, who kicked back. The agency said, no way, not going to happen. And then the story just fizzled out, and we haven't heard anything since. So another one of these major issues to be worried about. I want to talk to you about something now. You're going to think I'm making this up, but I want to talk to you about radioactive isotopes. Radioactive isotopes, these are atoms with an unstable nucleus, and they emit ionizing radiation. I'm going to talk to you about the products that are brought to us by the nuclear power industry. So they're released in small amounts as a matter of course, legally, but when you have accidents, they're released in large amounts into the environment and they enter the food chain. And so think 3 Mile Island, Hanford, Chernobyl, Fukushima. Ionizing radiation is the radiation that the radiologist goes behind the wall to minimize exposure to. It's the radiation that they put a lead apron over you at the dental office and around your neck, a lead collar, to minimize your exposure to. It's an indisputable human carcinogen, and there has never been any established dose at which there is no risk to be exposed to for developing cancer. Every exposure places you at risk. So when Chernobyl blew, we had milk in a few days. We had radiation in our milk in a few days. But the problem was there were no signs in the market. Above the dairy case, it didn't say, by the way, you may not want to drink this right now because it's full of strontium-90. Or, hey, Mom, maybe think twice before you serve your kids this milk. It has iodine-131 in it. And it was no different with Fukushima. I'm from the West Coast. We got the biggest dose. And we're still getting exposed. And they're still dumping 100 tons of highly radioactive water into the Pacific every 24 hours. And Building 4 could go. It's a high likelihood about that cooling pond getting exposed. So what happens? We have this radiation release, and milk has become that kind of proverbial canary in the coal mine. That's where it concentrates. That's where we see it first. So we know if it's in the milk, well, it's in the food chain. So what kind of things do we see in the milk? Well, strontium-90, as I mentioned. Strontium-90 has a half-life of about 28 years. It means it takes 28 years for half of the radioactivity to decay away. And it's a calcium analog, so the body treats it like calcium. It sequesters it in bone and teeth, and there it remains, radiating. It can cause leukemia and bone cancer. Then there's cesium-137, has a half-life of 30 years, likes to concentrate in muscle. Cesium, there was a report, I think it was last year, they went and tested milk in dairy cows in the areas surrounding where Chernobyl, where the heavy fallout was. And 26 years later, and the milk is so super hot with cesium that they said, don't drink this. They're actually saying don't drink it. And then there's iodine-131, which has a half-life of about 8 days, concentrates in the thyroid gland, and can lead to thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. And see, because of the latent period of carcinogenesis, you may not develop a cancer for 5 to 50 years. And so who's going to make that association to the radioactive isotopes they were drinking unwittingly? Where's the recourse? Who do you call? Nobody. So nobody's interested in that. So there was a study that was published just a few months ago in the Open Journal of Pediatrics. And they reported that between March and December of 2011, there was a 21 to 28% increase in congenital hypothyroidism in newborns in the western states of North America. Proof of causation? Don't know. Compelling? That's because in 36 other states, congenital hypothyroidism went down or leveled off. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. At the very least, it would be good to inform people and let them make an informed choice about if this is something that they really want to be exposed to. So I'm going to switch gears now, and I'm going to talk to you as quickly as I can with some solution ideas. So if drinking the mammary gland secretions of another species was a reliable way to prevent bone fracture, we know that the populations that consume the most milk would have the strongest bones, and they'd be free of this disease, right? But we know just the opposite is what we see. So we can take that myth and we can extinguish that. Let's just get rid of that right now. Because living in that mythology then exposes us to, in each glass, nearly 60 different hormones and growth factors, about 30 different bovine proteins that can elicit an allergic reaction in us, some subtle, some very serious, a vast array of chemical contaminants that are found to consistently concentrate in milk and dairy products, lactose, which is indigestible by 75% of the population of this planet, and results in sorts of gastrointestinal distress. And milk may very well be a disease vector. Now, we talked about MAP and Crohn's, but we haven't talked about bovine leukemia and bovine AIDS and all the bacterial contamination. So let's stop talking about milk, because milk is a distraction. It's a big distraction from where our minds should really be focused if what we care about is bone health. Okay? Osteoporosis is what we call a multifactorial disease. There are numerous factors that come together to produce risk of developing the condition. And therefore, the silver bullet approach, which we've been using now for way too long, which is drowning the body in ever-increasing levels of calcium, doesn't work. It doesn't work any more than drowning the body in huge amounts of dietary protein in hopes that you're going to build muscle. Doesn't work. Muscle's got to be stimulated. It's got to have resistance. It's got to have force put on it. And that's how it gets bigger and stronger. It's the same way with bone. Bone has to be stimulated and have stress put on it if it's going to become stronger and be more fracture resistant. So if we look at this idea of just cramming calcium down our throat and trying to prevent a disease, again, we're distracted from the fact that bone health is not just about calcium. Bone health is about 17 some nutrients that are all involved that must be present in adequate quantities for the body to build bone. Our body's rebuilding our skeleton 6 times entirely over our lifetime, constantly remodeling. Osteoclast breaking down old bone, osteoblast building up new bone. But there's so much more than calcium. There's copper, and there's zinc, and there's boron, and there's magnesium, and manganese, and phosphorus, and essential fats, and vitamin C, and D, and B6, and B12. It's all got to be there. And that's what we never hear about. So it's interesting when you look at these surveys that are done. There have been 2 multinational studies have been published since 1992. One was 92, Calcified Tissue International. They looked all around the world, and they looked at the highest incidence of hip fracture, and they looked at animal protein intake in the diet. The higher the animal protein intake, the higher the incidence of hip fracture. And the inverse was so. The lower the animal protein intake, the lower the incidence of hip fracture. And then UCSF, University of California, San Francisco researchers put another study together, same kind of way, and they found that the people that consumed the most animal protein had almost a 4 times elevated risk of suffering a hip fracture compared to those who were eating the least. And we don't have to get caught up in the mechanism as to why, because since 1988, there have been 87, 88, 89 studies published, all of which have shown that as the diet is richer in fruits and vegetables and antioxidants, the bones get bigger and more fracture resistant. Over and over and over again, these studies show this. But you don't hear about it. That's because the Fed spends about $3 million a year promoting the consumption of fruits and vegetables. And the dairy industry spends about 50 times that much, about $150 million a year, convincing you to consume milk. And the reason is this is where all the bone nutrients are. This is where they're concentrated. So when we make a decision to have the bacon cheeseburger, we move ourselves farther away from bone health. When we enrich our diet with fruits and vegetables, plant foods that are full of all of these important nutrients, plus the phytochemicals, we move ourselves closer to bone health. Okay? And I go into a lot of detail about this in Whitewash, but I want to just talk to you about a couple things I call bone robbers, which are not discussed very often. Before I do that, I want to make a statement about vitamin D. If you haven't seen, these surveys over and over again are showing that we have broad-spread vitamin D deficiency in our society, and there may be any number of reasons responsible for this. It could be that we're not getting outdoors as much as we should, because vitamin D, of course, is produced by exposure to sun. It could be that when we're outdoors, we're covered up and we're wearing sunscreens to avoid sun exposure, because obviously people are concerned about skin cancer. But vitamin D is absolutely essential to not only bone health, but to a number of other things that are becoming apparent. And without adequate vitamin D, we can't absorb the calcium and integrate it into our bones. So it is a really important element that I'm going to recommend you get checked out, because you don't know. You might be producing sufficient levels of vitamin D, but the best way to know is talk to your health practitioner and ask them, can I get a vitamin D test, find out what your levels are, and then work with them, because supplementation of vitamin D is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. If I take 1,000 IUs of vitamin D and you take it, we're going to have a different response in terms of boosting our levels of vitamin D in the body. So you want to find out what you need, what would be a reasonable or appropriate supplementation level, and work with somebody who can track that with you, okay? Then I want to talk to you about a handful of bone robbers, one being alcohol. Alcohol, obviously in our society, we don't think a lot about having a couple of glasses of wine with dinner or a couple of beers at the ball game or what have you, but alcohol does, it's hard on bone. It's hard on bone for a number of reasons. It interferes with the proper function of osteoblast cells, which are required to build up new bone. it causes the body to excrete important bone nutrients like calcium, magnesium, copper, and zinc, vitamin C. It also can interfere with the production of certain enzymes that are necessary for the metabolism of vitamin D so our body can actually use the form that it does. And of course, alcohol places us at risk of falling because we lose our sense of stability with alcohol. And why is that important? Well, in 90% of the hip fractures that we see, there's a fall that precipitates it. So what we've got to be looking at is how do we prevent falls in the first place, in addition to these other lifestyle changes that we can do to minimize our risk of developing osteoporosis. Next thing I want to talk to you about is sodium. We all know about sodium. We know we consume a lot of sodium. And this plays a role in bone disease as well. We know that after about 2,400 milligrams of sodium intake, for every 500 additional milligrams of sodium we're exposed to, we lose about 10 milligrams of calcium. We excrete about 15 milligrams of calcium from caffeine. From a couple of cups of coffee, you lose about 15 milligrams of calcium a day. And that's, cups of coffee. You say people are nursing these towers of coffee around these days, like 64 ounces or multiples of them. So think about the kind of how much caffeine you may be exposed to in a day, what you're consuming. Think about the alcohol, the sodium. Every 500 milligrams over 2,400, you're losing about 10 milligrams of calcium. When you look at a bacon cheeseburger, about 1,400 milligrams of sodium right there. And that's just one thing. So many of us could be thousands and thousands of milligrams of sodium in excess of our needs, and thereby playing a role in calcium losses. And I want to talk to you about medications. We've known for years that certain medications like corticosteroids are really hard on bone, elevate risk of fracture. And we know that some of the cardiac medications that are very popular in this country also cause a problem with bone health. And now the class of antidepressants, which are very widely prescribed in the U.S., the SSRIs, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it seems to be that after about 5 years of use, there's a doubling in the risk of hip fracture. So the take-home on all this is have a conversation with your healthcare provider, because if you are on medications of various sorts, there may be medications you can take that will produce the same outcome, have the same effect that you're looking for, but they're not the class of drug that's hard on your bone and may be increasing your risk of fracture. And then the final thing is sedentary living, exercise. And I can imagine some of you are thinking, exercise, schmexercise, I'm so tired of hearing about exercise. But there's so many benefits. There are just so many benefits to exercise, to moving our bodies. And this is a huge player in regards to bone health. Do not underestimate this. I can't overemphasize it here today. If you've ever had a limb in a cast. When I was 9, I had an arm cast, and I'll never forget when they sawed it off. I was just stunned. It was like this noodle in there. I said, what happened to my arm? And they said, well, it shrank, but it'll come back. Well, it shrank. We call that muscular atrophy. It shrank because of disuse. It wasn't being stimulated, and the muscle shrank. And bone does the same thing. With disuse, it demineralizes, and it gets smaller and weaker and more prone to fracture. When we don't use our bones, we're placing ourselves at this risk. So bone responds to stress that's placed on it, weight bearing. And, we learned from the astronauts when they first started going into extended orbits, they'd come back and they could barely walk because they had lost lots of their bone mass. And they weren't stimulating their bones and their muscles. And now they have special equipment to keep their bones and muscles healthy while they're in these extended orbits. But we know that top athletes have 50% greater bone mass. We know that people that aren't athletes, that are just the most active in our society, they've got 40% greater bone mass than sedentary people. But the CDC says that 55% of us don't get the basic amount of exercise. to ward off chronic degenerative disease. And a full 26% don't get any exercise at all. Just the basic movements. I call them chair people. They move from the chair at the office to the chair at the dinner table to the chair in front of the TV to the chair in the car and the body's not getting stimulated. You've got to work out the bones. You've got to stimulate them. You've got to find ways every day. You're given an option. You got an elevator. You got stairs. Take the stairs. Make an investment in your health. Okay? And this is really powerful. It doesn't matter how old you are. There have been tens of thousands of people who have been looked at all over the world. And they've shown that people, even in their 7th and 8th decade of life, if they're put on an exercise regimen, they can build bone mass in as little as a year. And they can build anywhere from 1% to 8% we've seen in people in their 70s and 80s. Now, what does that equate to in terms of your risk of suffering a fracture? Well, we figure that for each 1% that you increase your bone mass, you reduce your risk of fracture by about 6%. So let's just be conservative and say you employ an exercise regime and regimen and you build up your bone mass by 5%. Over the next year, by the end of 2014. Theoretically, you've reduced your risk of fracture by 30%. You haven't looked at alcohol, you haven't looked at sodium, you haven't looked at your bigger dietary plan, these other factors, you haven't looked at medications. This is really, really important stuff to look at, okay? So give some thought to what kind of an exercise program you can incorporate into your life where you're doing something at least a few days a week, if not every day of the week. And then finally, do I have a couple more minutes? Okay. I just want to close by saying, every day in this country, well-intentioned, highly qualified, well-credentialed healthcare authorities look at their patients, their clients, and say, you need to increase your milk consumption. They look at women who have become pregnant and they say, okay, it's time to bone up. You're building a new skeleton. Let's get you on the plan. Yogurt, cheese, milk every day. Or they say, Johnny is not going to grow up healthy and strong unless you make sure he's getting this milk. And I understand it, because these folks grew up steeped in the same mythology that we did. And they believe that the advice that they're giving is helpful to their clients, to their patients. But I think it's really tragic that the people to whom we entrust our health, that we seek out advice about decisions to make how to protect our health, are still perpetuating this mythology, are still telling people that something is going to go wrong with them because they're not nursing from another species. There are 5,400 different mammalian species that we know of on this planet. And in every instance, these mammals produce milk for their offspring. But in every instance, that milk is nutritionally unique. It means the balance of the constituents in there vary according to the needs of that species. So it's species specific. So rat's milk is exceptionally high in protein because rats double their birth weight in 4 days. We double our birth weight in 180. And whale milk is exceptionally rich in fat because it has a consistency of mayonnaise. A baby whale has to develop blubber to survive in the cold water environment that it lives in. So whales aren't drinking cow's milk, and cows aren't drinking goat's milk, and elephants aren't drinking the milk of hippos. We're the only ones that do this. And I really believe that the sooner that we step back from this, the sooner that we leave this mythology behind, the sooner we can reclaim the health that we have forfeited all these years being wrapped up in this myth. Thank you. Yes.
Great speech. I am a little hard of hearing.
So am I.
So maybe next time turn the volume up a little bit. But I want to ask Howard Lehman. He was on Oprah.
Yes.
And it was talked about mad cow disease. And mad cow disease, another name for it is Alzheimer's. Is this transferred through the milk also?
I don't. Obviously, Howard Lyman is kind of a leading authority on prion disease. He knows a great deal about it. I do not. I do know that mad cow disease was found in some dairy cattle, and they kind of followed the thread back of where they were sourced and said they came from Canada, that we imported them from Canada. I do not know. I don't have the information to know about whether prion disease can be passed on by way of milk, but there's a lot of disease in the dairy herds in the U.S. that's just not talked about. The bovine leukemic virus. There was a study done where they tested people and found that they had antibodies to bovine leukemia. Well, then they're getting exposed. Now, people will tell you, well, you don't have to worry about that because of pasteurization. And we really don't know if it crosses species. Well, we know we've infected chimpanzees with bovine leukemic virus, and they share a lot of genetic background with us. But these things are hard to come across. They're not being talked about readily, but I think it's something to definitely be cautious about. Again, the bovine leukemia is, well, it's being pasteurized so it kills the virus. But what about the milk that gets out? You've read the stories. Oh, unfortunately, we're recalling this unpasteurized milk that got to market a week later. It's a big recall a couple years ago in Chicago. Well, what about that? So what do we do about if, BLV was in that milk and got to market and people drank it? Sorry, I can't be more specific to your question. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. Question about the bone robbers. You had not mentioned carbonated drinks, so I was wondering about what that was. And also, on Dr. Oz, it approved 15 minutes in the tanning bed for vitamin D. I don't know what you think about that. And just wondering about, the WIC program.
The which program?
The WIC program for women, low income. They're given these tickets. They can go to the grocery store and purchase milk and eggs and dairy, cheese. What if we somehow could change that and they only can get greens,
I love your thinking. I love your thinking. Yeah, it's unfortunate that a lot of the surplus foods that are given to children and low-income people are the very foods that we shouldn't be eating in the first place, that are going to send them down that same disease path that we see so much of in this country. I don't know about that. There's, as far as the vitamin D, I myself have not looked into what has been referred to as safe tanning beds. I really can't speak to that with any knowledge. I think the vitamin D supplement is one way that everybody can go. Some people have no problem with going out and getting sun exposure. I can't. I got my lifetime dose. I've got skin cancer, and I got to be very, very careful. So I have to use a supplement. But I think it is tragic that a lot of these programs, well-intending again, wow, we're gonna make sure that they're having a healthy diet and getting the calories they need every day, but it's just the wrong foods that we're providing. Sorry. Yes.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of the kids today, the young people, they don't breastfeed anymore. So you have formula for the first, 6 months of life, and then they go right into milk. So if the recommendation is no milk, then what do you feed the young people? I mean, the babies, kids 6 months and older, do they just need water and give them a good diet, or is there something else that you would recommend? This
is tragic that we make breastfeeding seem like something of the past, a chore. I've been told I have to stop. So maybe what I can do is meet you. I'm sorry, I didn't see where you went, but I can meet you in the back and we can talk about this in a little more detail. Okay. I'm compliant. I'll follow the request.